Hey everyone, just a quick note. This episode is part of our special series about Citizens United. The series coincides with the release of our new book, Master Plan: The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America. You can get our new book at levernews.com/book. If you'd like to hear other episodes from this series, be sure to check out the Lever Time feed or visit our website at levernews.com. On with the show. From the Lever's reader-supported newsroom, this is Lever Time. I'm David Sirota. For 15 years, lawmakers have been trying to find a way to overturn Citizens United, the landmark Supreme Court case that allows corporations and billionaires to overrun our political system with money. None of those efforts to overturn that case have succeeded so far. But one of those efforts is making the rounds again in Congress. It's called the Citizens Over Corporations Act, and it aims to go big. A group of Congressional Democrats wants the bill to become the 28th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. The main problem? Trying to pass an amendment is hard. Like, really hard. The last one that was ratified literally took 200 years to pass. In this next installment of our new series, MONEYBOMB, I'm sitting down with one congressman who's co-sponsoring this amendment and believes it really might finally have a shot to overturn Citizens United. That's coming up on today's episode of Lever Time.
The White House this afternoon, Judge Anthony Kennedy was sworn in to fill the Supreme Court seat left vacant by the retirement of Justice Lewis Powell.
In the Lever's new book, Master Plan: The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America, we tell the story of how a secret memo written by Lewis Powell served as a blueprint for the corporate takeover of the country. After writing that infamous memo, Lewis Powell served on the U.S. Supreme Court, where he orchestrated rulings that favored big business and deregulated the campaign finance system. Powell's successor was a lobbyist from California named Anthony Kennedy. Here's what ABC News said about Kennedy in 1988 at the time of his appointment to the Supreme Court.
Overall, Justice Kennedy is expected to follow Justice Powell's style and tone.
And did he ever? Justice Anthony Kennedy became the author of the landmark Citizens United opinion in 2010, which built upon the campaign finance precedents written by Lewis Powell. As we detail in our book Master Plan and in the last episode of this series, Citizens United blew the doors off of campaign finance restrictions, ushering in the era of dark money that we're living in today. Last week, retired Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy released his new memoir. Ironically, that memoir was published on the same day as our new book, Master Plan. In preparing for the launch of our book, I revisited the Citizens United opinion and what exactly Anthony Kennedy wrote. I just have to share it here because it still blows my mind. That ruling states, quote, "This court now concludes that independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption." That's a direct quote, but it goes on, quote, "that speakers may have influence over or access to elected officials does not mean that those officials are corrupt, and the appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in this democracy." Let me say that last line again for the folks in the back, because it's so wild. Quote, "The appearance of influence or access will not cause the electorate to lose faith in this democracy." Yeah, that did not age well.
When you claim that a fictitious entity, a corporation, has more rights than flesh and blood people, you are beginning to distort democracy to a point where it becomes meaningless.
The American people know this is wrong. The American people know that.
The protesters feel that this Supreme Court ruling is a threat to the democratic values of the United States.
This is something that's got to turn around, or else we won't have an America the way we knew America to be.
Citizens United was the worst court decision in modern American history.
Contrary to what Kennedy wrote in the Citizens United decision, survey data tell us that a majority of Americans believe that corruption is destroying democracy. A Pew Research survey found that 80% of American adults say campaign donors have too much influence over Congress. More than half of those surveyed said they believe that all or most of the people who currently serve as elected officials ran for office to make a lot of money. And do you blame people for having those views when every day on the news, Americans hear things like this?
Trump promised the big oil executives that he would deliver their wish list if they spent $1 billion to return him to the White House.
In his new memoir, Anthony Kennedy, the author of the Citizens United decision, says, quote, "All of us are concerned about money in politics." In a recent interview with CBS, Kennedy also says he's worried about the state of democracy.
I'm concerned democracy presumes an open, rational, thoughtful, decent discussion where you respect the dignity of the person with whom you disagree. And if it doesn't have that, then democracy as we know it is in danger.
This is truly incredible. Anthony Kennedy wrote the ruling that floods American politics with unlimited money, the ruling that created the dark money groups and super PACs that drown out every other voice with negative ads. And now he's saying he's worried about democracy? This is like that meme where the hot dog guy crashes his car.
Yeah, we're all trying to find the guy who did this.
Yeah, apparently Citizens United author Anthony Kennedy is trying to find the Anthony Kennedy who did this to our democracy. It's clear from his memoir that Kennedy overwhelmingly places the responsibility of keeping money out of politics on voters. It's a tired claim that feels increasingly ignorant, but voters are getting fed up. At least on the surface, it seems like lawmakers are beginning to recognize the outrage. Every year since the 2010 Citizens United ruling, there have been congressional efforts to try to overturn it. Needless to say, none of them have stuck. But certain lawmakers keep trying, and some of those lawmakers want to go big by passing an amendment to the Constitution. Passing an amendment is no easy task. It's been 33 years since the last time we did it.
During today's session, members of the House of Representatives engaged in debate over the recently ratified 27th Amendment to the Constitution.
The 27th Amendment says that if members of Congress vote to raise their own pay, they won't get that increase until after the next election. It's an anti-corruption amendment that prevents immediate pay increases for lawmakers who've already been elected. This constitutional amendment was ratified in 1992. When was the amendment first proposed? 1789, more than 200 years earlier. It was actually one of the very first constitutional amendments ever proposed in the history of the United States. James Madison, a representative from Virginia who went on to become the fourth president of the United States, came up with the idea. Admittedly, the 27th Amendment had an exceptional path to the Constitution. But the point is that constitutional amendments are really difficult to pass. For an amendment to be ratified, 3/4 of the states in America have to approve it. That means 38 of these quote-unquote United States have to agree on something. So let's fast forward to today. Democratic lawmakers from 4 different states introduced the Citizens Over Corporations Act. If ratified, it would become the 28th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. One of the lawmakers behind that bill is from my own state of Colorado.
Good to be with you. Joe Neguse. I represent Colorado's 2nd Congressional District in the United States Congress.
Joe Neguse was elected to Congress in 2018. He told me that the most insidious way that our political system has changed since he first held public office in 2008 is all thanks to Citizens United.
The Citizens United decision has so dramatically changed the political environment of the United States for the worse that it is hard to put into words the profound ramifications of that decision.
I wanted to understand more about how Neguse thinks about the whole problem of Citizens United, and more broadly, what he thinks we should do about the state of corruption in American politics. I started by reading that excerpt from the Citizens United ruling to Joe Neguse. So one of the things in Citizens United, the core precepts, this is the direct quote. It always boggles my mind to read it, but I'm going to read it out. Quote, independent expenditures, including those made by corporations, do not give rise to corruption or the appearance of corruption. I mean, that's literally in the ruling stated as a fact. And I think they hung this on the idea that independent expenditures by like a super PAC, because it is independent from a candidate, at least on paper, that it can't be a corrupting influence on a candidate. And for those who don't know how campaigns and elections work, just talk to us a little bit about why perhaps you believe, if you do, that that is essentially a legal fiction, that this idea that there's like an independent expenditure that the donors to those donations can't possibly influence who is benefiting from that. Like, is that true? Is that not true? Like in the granular experience of campaigns, like talk to us a little bit about what you make of that.
Yeah, I mean, a couple things I'd say. First, it's patently untrue. It is a legal fiction. I don't think, I mean, there are some who might charitably describe that line as, essentially a sort of cynical failure of imagination on the part of the justices who wrote the majority opinion. My view is they very clearly knew it was a legal fiction. It was a pretextual, rationalization for their decision. And, the evidence that you can point to that kind of shows that to be the case is everything that has happened in the ensuing 15 years. By the way, separate subject, but that opinion was also a harbinger, in my view, of the opinions that have followed that have completely undermined our corruption laws, to whereas now even quid pro quo corruption has been rendered, kind of toothless by the Supreme Court by virtue of decisions that they've made in the last couple of years, which you've covered and, we could talk a little bit about. But in terms of the core part of your question about why this is a legal fiction, an example of how this would be a legal fiction. Well, you don't need to look, kind of deep into a granular example. I'll offer you perhaps the most obvious example in the 2024 presidential election, right? You have the richest man in the world, right? Mr. Musk, who spent hundreds of millions of dollars on an independent operation in Pennsylvania, a so-called, quote, independent operation. That operation involved everything from voter engagement, voter registration, a so-called lottery in which people would get millions of dollars, right, for signing up to vote, and then obviously more targeted advocacy for President Trump's re-election effort, and he won. Does anyone believe that was not coordinated, that it wasn't obvious to everyone that he was supporting President Trump, right? Some of this is almost asymmetrical, right, in the sense that we're spending our time trying to make the case in a very intellectual way that what we see with our own eyes doesn't actually exist. Like, it's very clear. Most Americans understand it. Most Americans get that if somebody is spending hundreds of millions of dollars to, in support of your election or your reelection, that obviously that's going to be problematic.
Before we get to the constitutional amendment question, let's talk a little bit of how this ends up shaping the way Congress works. It seems to me there's the obvious, I got money from a donor who wanted me to do something, or the super PAC got money from a donor who wanted me to do something. Now I'm in office, and this sort of expectation of legislative favors. But it also seems to me that an equally problematic part of the way the corruption system works is, as we saw with like the crypto industry, it spends a ton of money in an election against its critics, which sends a huge message to everyone else in Congress. If you get crosswise with us, you could be next. So I just talked to us a little bit about how this kind of system can work without money even necessarily being transacted. Like, you're working on a bill, if you're antagonizing a specific industry, how that industry, all it has to do is kind of wave its wallet at other members of Congress to keep them out or away from what you're doing, because they're afraid, right? I mean, is that the way functionally day to day that sort of big money has influence in a place like Congress? This sort of silent, imperceptible, almost quid pro quo. We know who has money and who doesn't, and we don't want to like poke the bear, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I would say this. It depends on the member of Congress that you're talking about, right? I think I served as the vice chairman of the antitrust subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee when Democrats had the majority. Actually, one of our lead staffers on that committee was Lena Khan, who, of course, was later appointed by President Biden to serve as chairwoman of the Federal Trade Commission, and who applied a muscular approach to the work of the FTC, far more muscular approach than anything I think at the FTC that's happened in perhaps the last 50, 60 years. Anyway, with respect to that effort, we pushed very hard, a colleague of mine named David Cicilline, whom I think to try to legislate in the Congress in the antitrust space, right? To try to make the case that these monopolies had to be broken up. We held hearings, but that effort, ultimately was unsuccessful. Legislatively, we got some stuff done, but not the large, sort of more structural changes that we were pursuing, in part because, yes, to your point, money has so corroded the system that we received a lot of, headwinds, both from Republicans, but also, just to be candid with you, with some Democrats as well. And so that it's something we continue, myself and others. There's a caucus of members, Krista Luzio, Pramila Jayapal, some others who are sort of all working together to try to make the case, at least with respect to the antitrust side. You offered an example in terms of, again, how this plays out, the super PAC spending around financial services and the crypto industry. And I thought you described it really well. I don't think I could describe it better than you did. I mean, at the end of the day, yes, the point here is that you have massive amounts of money, $20 million, $30 million spent in a single congressional race. And by the way, often spent in a way in which it's channeled through a 501c4 entity, ostensible nonprofit that doesn't have to disclose its donors. And so the voters don't necessarily even ever find out that the crypto industry, let's say, or any other example you might offer, that was funding the attack ads that destroyed a member of Congress, right, who decided that they were going to take on the battle, as I have, for example, on antitrust issues.
The donors through these super PACs, they don't even have to obviously advertise on their own issue. In other words,
correct,
crypto donors can be advertising. Not only do you not know who they are or whatever donor, not only are they not advertising necessarily on their specific issue, hey, we want this legislation or that, and they don't have to disclose who they are or even what they want, but we all better believe that the people who were then in power, whose seats they control, know what they want.
Do you remember the pandemic example? I mean, there was an effort, there was a crypto-related effort that existed that, to try to influence elections, that ostensibly on the surface, they marketed it as essentially an effort for public health investments during the course of the pandemic. I don't know if you remember this example. This was a couple of years ago, where the campaign activity was connected to advocacy for public health funding, but in fact, it was just a pretextual cover for crypto, for the crypto industry.
After the break, I asked Colorado Democratic Congressman Joe Neguse to explain the Citizens Over Corporations Amendment and how it could end the Supreme Court's Citizens United precedent. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Lever Time.
So I'm joining my colleagues to reintroduce my constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, as I have for many years, to affirm what should be obvious, that our democracy is not for sale.
That's California's Democratic Senator Adam Schiff 1 month ago at a press conference announcing the Citizens Over Corporations Amendment. The co-sponsors of the bill are Democratic Representatives Summer Lee, Jim McGovern, and our guest today, Congressman Joe Neguse. I asked Neguse to explain exactly what this amendment strives to do.
I mean, essentially what you're doing is you're overturning the core parts of Citizens United. You're establishing that both the states and the Congress have the ability to regulate spending in our elections, which, by the way, even that, I mean, is something we could go back into the case law. The decision long before Citizens United, Buckley versus Vallejo, right, which ultimately, in part, unleashed spending in our elections in terms of their construction of the First Amendment. But in any event, Citizens United obviously was a far more pernicious, decision. Bottom line, it would give states and the Congress the ability to regulate spending, to set caps and limits that would not ultimately in any way contravene the First Amendment, and would ensure that judicial review would not, further limit the Congress or the states from doing so. And in order to become law, you would essentially have to have this resolution, which has 39 co-sponsors in the House. We're working every day to get more co-sponsors. I have no doubt we will get the vast majority, if not every House Democrat on board. And I think I'm going to be able to get a couple of Republicans as well, which we can talk about. But you need to get 2/3 support in the House and in the Senate, and then ultimately ratification by 3/4 of the states. What's interesting is that Congress, I actually think, is the largest obstacle, not the states. In order to refer it to the states, you don't need the president's signature, right? So this isn't something that would require President Trump's support. Many states, including conservative-leaning states, all right, and purple states, Alaska is a good example of this, have already passed either by referendum, a vote of the people, or their legislatures have passed resolutions that have called for an overturning of Citizens United or something akin to it. And the first state to do that, which I know you're aware of, was Colorado. Back in 2012, we actually were the first state by a vote of the people that signaled that the congressional delegation, Colorado's congressional delegation, ought to pursue a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. So I think if we can get this to the states, there's a growing kind of consensus across maybe not formal party lines, but certainly across political affiliation that, liberal, conservative, just disaffected voters in general all kind of get that the system has just become far too corrupt.
Yeah, talk to us a little bit about the Republican side here. I mean, I think a lot of people perceive, the Republicans are on the side of big money, and a lot of Democrats are too, but the Democrats at least are more open to the idea of trying to crack down on egregious corruption. I mean, it is true. There have been Republican leaning states that have signaled that they don't like Citizens United either. I mean, what do you make of that? What's your interpretation of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that it is a byproduct of the sort of corrupt system that the Supreme Court has ultimately blessed by virtue of that Citizens United decision, right? It helped create an ecosystem by which now every election is potentially available to the highest bidder. And there are some Republicans who find great discomfort in that. And the question is, are they willing, to kind of go against the party orthodoxy in terms of the conventional views of the First Amendment and the way in which, that's been construed by the sort of legal academics on their side of the aisle. And that is something that I think we're continuing to kind of try to push. It is interesting. I do think there's room for, interesting bedfellows. I go back to the antitrust example. My strongest partner in the effort to take on, some of these monopolies or, duopolies was Ken Buck, a congressman from Colorado, as you know. Very
not exactly a liberal.
Yeah, no, very conservative Republican, right? But we worked very closely together on this. I think he had a general unease with the idea that you would have just, one singular trillion-dollar company that could just destroy, small businesses in his district in Longmont or the Eastern Plains of Colorado. So yeah, I think that there's potential. By the way, it's not just on End Citizens United. I mean, I lead the effort, have led the effort in Congress to ban stock trading by members of Congress, have done that for 4 years, to lead the effort to ban it, and to ban members of Congress from becoming lobbyists. And both of those efforts also are bipartisan. There's a growing group of members who I think are, again, find great discomfort with those practices. And so you just got to try to, build coalitions wherever you can.
So the last constitutional amendment that passed was in 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And I think people can't even really imagine at this point a constitutional amendment passing. So I got to ask just a real talk kind of question. Is this something real that people should not just support kind of in theory, but is this a real thing, or is this a press release thing? In your vision, is this something that actually has a legitimate chance to actually happen? Maybe not tomorrow, but in the next, in the next decade.
Yes, I think so. I think our political system, by virtue of the infusion of money, by virtue of the technological changes and disruptions that are happening writ large in society, I think our political system is going through a very deep fluctuation, right? And just a period in which there's a lot of change. And you see that in the way in which, for example, redistricting reforms had emerged over the last decade. And now, obviously, different subject we could talk about, but what's happening in the various states regarding redistricting. People always assume that it's just sort of the way it is until it's not anymore. And I happen to believe that, yes, given the level of support at the ground level in the various states, given the way in which certain states are beginning to try to find creative ways to essentially do this on their own and not wait for Congress. Maine, there's an interesting ballot measure. Montana, there's an interesting discussion emerging there of ways in which they are trying to invoke inherent state authorities, right, and the ability of states to regulate corporations, which is long settled law, to be able to legislate in this space. I just think there's a lot of movement and momentum, and I have to believe that yes, that it's possible, and I wouldn't be trying if I didn't think so.
We're going to take one more quick break. When we come back, I asked Congressman Joe Neguse about one other piece of anti-corruption legislation that could stop lobbyists in their tracks. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Lever Time. I'm talking today with Democratic Congressman Joe Neguse of Colorado. I want to turn to what you just alluded to, which is efforts below the Citizens United constitutional amendment that could be shorter term. You are a co-sponsor of a bill with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, which deals with the insidious problem of the revolving door between Congress and the industries that lobby Congress. Talk to us about that, about why day to day that revolving door is a problem and what you're proposing.
Part of this is just fundamentally about rebuilding trust with the American public, right? The framers, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, who read the Federalist Papers as they discuss the Congress as Article 1 branch of our government, the people's house. They never intended for members of the House of Representatives to, serve and then go on to leverage that service in the House as lobbyists for, corporate or, moneyed interests. And I think a big reason why there's this loss of kind of faith and trust by the American public in our federal government is in part because they understand that these types of practices are allowed, right? So right now there's a 1 year effectively cooling off period for members of the House and for the Senate. My view is it should just be disallowed. It just should be banned. It doesn't, I think if you ask most folks, I do a lot of town halls in my district. I do a lot of pop-ups at farmers markets, and we call them Congress in your corner. So I'll go to our local bus station here in Boulder and just meet with constituents, just talk to them about what's on their minds. This bill is, coupled with the stock trade ban, the most popular piece of legislation that I've introduced in my time, because people get it at just a visceral level that you shouldn't be able to leverage your friendships, the partnerships that you've made as a member of Congress, serving, right, to essentially make a lot of money lobbying for corporate interests. And so, I introduced my bill with Representative Ocasio-Cortez, and we're pushing to get more co-sponsors. That one has been a little bit more difficult to get co-sponsors on, shall we say, than maybe my other bills, but we're pushing, right?
I mean, this gets to the really deep level of corruption in the sense of presumably there are members of Congress who are influenced, whether consciously, by the way, or subconsciously, in the sense of, hey, in 2, 4, 6 years, I may want to be a lobbyist. I may want to get paid a lot of money to be a lobbyist. So I want to be able to go through that revolving door. And in wanting to go through that revolving door, maybe I want to be friendly here on this or that piece of legislation to begin making friends with the industries that will want me as a lobbyist, right? I mean, I do feel like, and I'm not asking you to call out any one specific member of Congress, but I guess I would just ask, is that dynamic like a real, do you feel that? Do you sense that?
I've always believed, again, right, human behavior responds to incentives, right? So insofar as you want to change behavior,
right,
change incentives. And so the solution to what you just described, which, yes, I do see that in the Congress, I think, is to ban the practice entirely, which will then remove any incentives, right? Because you've now...
Right, this is not an option.
Correct. Exactly.
In 2016, the last poll before that election showed that Donald Trump was losing to Democrats on every issue except corruption. The latest Reuters poll shows the Democrats on the question of who do you trust to handle and combat corruption. The latest poll right now, as we head into the midterms, shows the Republicans with a 2016-esque lead on that question. I'm curious why you think that is. Like, how do you explain that? Donald Trump is in the White House. Donald Trump is like explicitly, flagrantly, frankly, almost unapologetically, transactionally corrupt in that office. Headlines every day. And yet, apparently, when you ask people, who do you trust more to deal with corruption? It's the Republicans, just as it was in 2016. Like, what do we make of that?
Well, one, that should concern and trouble certainly every American and definitely every Democrat, and troubles me. And it's one of the reasons why I am pushing so hard and, we did this launch earlier this year of what we called the End Corruption Now agenda. Basically, a number of young reformers in Congress, folks who've not, really served that long. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, of course, Pat Ryan, a number of others, Amelia Sykes, just young members. I think we're all millennials or younger. And part of the reason why I'm pushing so hard is this deficit that you just described. In terms of how I might explain that, I suppose I would say two things. I think one, the corruption that Republicans have engaged in and that Donald Trump has engaged in has been so overt and so brazen. These guys are, you're talking literally making billions of dollars on crypto schemes and meme coins, White House dinners with the president's donors and all the rest. It's so brazen, it's so overt that I worry the American public has become a little desensitized to it. They've normalized this wholesale corruption such that it doesn't, that question that you just noted that's posed to a voter, perhaps they don't find the contrast as clearly as they might otherwise. But I will also say part of this, I don't know if you'll recall this, but you go back to 2016. And I remember, of course, a lot of folks remember this during the debates where, then candidate Trump is confronted about his blatant use of tax loopholes to enrich himself and his family. And his response is, I used those and I would do it again. And why didn't why didn't Democrats, if you care so passionately about that, why didn't you change those? Because, of course, your donors are, leveraging the same loopholes. I do think, there is a danger here that if our reforms aren't bold enough, right, that folks are not going to take us seriously when we say that we very much are trying to root out corruption, right? You can take aim at all of the terrible practices that President Trump and the administration are engaging in, right? You can do what I did in the Judiciary Committee and confront the director of the FBI about the fact that he's day trading, right? He's trading stocks as he's director of the FBI. You can do that, but if you're not willing to also say we should ban this practice entirely, that Democratic members of Congress shouldn't be trading stocks, right? I don't trade stocks, never done that. If you're not willing to do that, then I don't know if the American people are necessarily going to believe you, right? That corruption is as pervasive and endemic, and that as you're as serious as you purport to be in terms of confronting it. And that's why the lobbying ban bill, the stock ban bill, the End Citizens United measure, another measure doesn't get a lot of attention. We could talk about it the next time, but a bill by Amelia Sykes in Ohio that she introduced to restore the definition of quid pro quo bribery, right, under federal law that the Supreme Court had eviscerated. And this connects to a huge pay-to-play scandal in Ohio involving the investor-owned utility out there and just blatant corruption in the state house. The point is, there's a lot that we could do, but there will be parts of our coalition that might find those reforms to be too bold. And I think we're just going to have to push forward anyway.
Congressman Joe Neguse of Colorado, thank you so much for taking your time today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Lever Time. Check out our brand new book, Master Plan, The Hidden Plot to Legalize Corruption in America. Get the book by using the link in our show notes or going to levernews.com/book. Lever Time is a production of The Lever. This episode was produced by Natalie Bettendorf. It was edited and mixed by Ron Doyle. Our theme music is by Nick Campbell. You can subscribe to Lever Time on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, the PRX mobile app, or wherever you get your podcasts. For ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, and access to the Lever's entire archive of investigative journalism, please consider becoming a premium subscriber. Head over to levernews.com to learn more about becoming a paid subscriber, or click the link in this episode's show notes. I'm David Sirota. We'll be back next week with another episode of Lever Time.